Hello, this is Dr. Sig, your instructor for the history of Britain. We've gone through this course over the last several months, and we're now in the ending stages of it. Concurrent with that, we're looking at the end of the British Empire as a topic to be examined. We've seen the development of Britain through the chaos of the Middle Ages, through its unification as a kingdom, and then its launch upon the world stage, in which an empire was developed. We should now look at the process of decolonization as it occurred over the years. This will be your case study attendant to the lecture and the readings that you've had assigned to you for this chapter. As you've just seen in the map that was just shown, Britain amassed a huge empire in the latter half of the last millennium. Indeed, Britain and its realm spread over a quarter of the world's land surface. As well, the British had the strongest navy and ruled the waves. In addition, Britain, during most of that period, was the strongest economic power, having been the first nation to fully industrialize. It led the way through its economic wealth, its military might, and its governance over an immense population of the world. But in the 20th century, that was to change. The British Empire began changing with the advent of World War I. As we've discussed during our section on the Victorian era, Britain not only had amassed a great empire, but also had built a balance of power system that had persisted in Europe for a century from the end of Napoleon until the First World War broke out. That balance of power system fell apart, though, with the inaction of the alliance structure following the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914. Great empires of the world came into conflagration with each other, and the world began to consume itself. This was a true world war fought around the entire world on all major continents, and Britain was at the heart of the conflict. Britain relied upon its colonial and dominion forces in order to fight the Entente powers, primarily Germany, Austria, and Turkey, again in all parts of the world. By the time the war was over, Britain had suffered millions of losses of men and materiel. More important in terms of colonialism, this was the first time that colonial and dominion parts of the empire had played such a role in saving the motherland. Soon thereafter, those living in the lands outside of the British Isles began to agitate for their own self-governance. During the First World War, Britain had given many of the Dominion states independent control of their military forces, and they had also gained a strong measure of self-governance divorced from central authority in London. This spread further to the colonies around the world. Nationalist movements began in earnest, first in an effort to gain limited self-government under the aegis of the Crown, but later to acquire full independence. At the time of the Great Depression, though, there was a severe economic impact around the empire that brought about an inability by Britain to improve the lives of its people. This further exacerbated the divide between colonial masters and the rulers. Up to the time of World War II, the British reaction had been one of heavy-handedness towards the nascent independent movements. Yet that was all to change with the advent of World War II. From December 1941 on, the Japanese forces in Asia easily took over British lands. The fortress at Singapore fell unthinkably. Malaya, the Pacific Island chains, and colonies in continental Southeast Asia also succumbed to the might of the Japanese. The impact on colonialism was extensive. This proved that British were not infallible, and indeed they would have difficulty in governing their former colonies. As well, many of the colonial peoples flocked to Japanese cause of Pan-Asian coast prosperity, and indeed some joined Japanese forces in fights against British and Allied efforts to retake colonial lands. In Europe, in the war against Germany, Britain again had to rely very strongly upon troops from the dominions and the colonies. Although a victor during World War II, Britain's might had been forever shattered. Its buildings lay in tatters due to the German blitz of its major cities. Factories and industry had been ruined, and its hold upon its colonial peoples was extremely weakened. Nations such as the United States and the Soviet Union would now be superpowers in the world, and Britain would no longer be able to rival them. The British people fully realized what was afoot, and a reaction set about internally in Britain. Politically, conservatives were out, a Labour government came in. It recognized the economic calamity it faced, and also that any pretense towards a moral argument of retention of colonies was a farce. So it began to assent to independence movements. First major colony to gain independence was that of India and the other constituent states upon the Indian subcontinent. As we've already examined in the formal lecture, the independence effort in India was one marred by many challenges. The disheveled economy following World War II, the loss of British influence upon the peoples, their strong desire for independence, and the inability of Britain and the independence leaders to control the religious antipathies that would eventually result in extensive warfare and bloodshed among the peoples of the subcontinent. In order to fully gain independence, India had to be divided into what would become a number of countries, independent of each other, but based upon the dominant religious element within that country. The independence of India really marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. And soon thereafter, much of it was to gain independence. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, colonies in the Americas, Asia, and especially Africa were prepared for independence. Britain was probably the best colonial master in this regard, in preparing its colonies for eventual independence. It built up infrastructure, it trained administrators, and imparted systems of governance that in many places persist to the present day. Most of Britain's empire was independent by the 1970s. A number of smaller colonies continued to gain independence in the 1980s and 1990s. The independence of Hong Kong, or rather the handover of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, was seen as the final death knell of the British colonial empire. There are a number of small colonies that continue to exist entirely dependent upon Britain. As well, the British influence through the establishment of the Commonwealth, which we will discuss in a later lecture, also allowed the legacy of Britain to go on. Hundreds of millions of people live today still under the influence of the legacies of the British Empire. Let's now look at our case study for today. You will adopt the role of one of the sides in the arguments over independence. We'll take the conservative side, take the progressive side regarding independence, or that of the peoples within the colonized countries becoming independent. Fully flesh out the main talking points for the positions of each side within the imperial debate over what would be the fate of the British Empire. Make a presentation on that, and then join in the synchronous discussion over that, being able to be conversant in your particular area. Complete this assignment by next week, and we will have a course discussion upon that. Thank you for being aboard this time.